This was not an easy week for me. This is a difficult passage, and I actually ended up, some of you may know David Orsman. He and I have remained friends over the years. He was a professor of homiletics. He taught seminary students how to give sermons, and he's a rather brilliant man, and I spoke with him this week about my sermon this week because I was deeply uncomfortable with the sermon. And David's answer to me was, good. He said, the parables aren't always designed to resolve anything. Sometimes they're just designed to make us think, and sometimes they are designed to disturb us. So with that in mind, let's talk about today's scripture. So for the second week in a row, we have an agricultural parable. But even though both of these parables are related to seeds and harvests, their meanings couldn't be more different. Last week, we discussed how the seeds fared as they landed on different types of soil. The parable taught us that different circumstances can cause different people to react to the word in different ways, and even taught us that a single person can react differently in different times and in different situations. We also touched on the extravagance of God's grace as he shares his word generously, not wishing that anyone would fail to hear the good news. But this week, our focus is on the crop itself. So let's take a look at the story. A farmer sows his field with good seed, but an enemy comes at night and sows weeds in the same fields that were just sown with the good seed. As the crop begins to grow, the slaves working in the field discover the fact that there are weeds mixed in with the good plants. The slaves ask the master if they should remove the weeds, but the master tells them to leave them. They would all be sorted out at the harvest. And for the second week in a row, I have learned a few things about agriculture. First, I learned that allowing the weeds to grow along with the crop is highly irregular. Saunders tells us that the surprise in the parable comes when the householder forbids them from removing the weeds. He directs the servants to let the wheat and weeds grow up together until the harvest, when the weeds will be collected first, bundled and burned, and then the wheat would be gathered into the barn. Ancient audiences might well have wondered what kind of farmer this is, and does he know what he's doing? The second thing that I learned is that the likely weed that was sown alongside the good seed was something called darnel. Darnel looks identical to wheat until it begins to mature, at which time it sprouts leaves. Darnel is poisonous in substantial quantities and is capable of killing a human, but in small amounts it's an intoxicant. And indeed, darnel was purposely cultivated to add to beer to increase the level of intoxication received from the beverage. We also know that darnel has a very robust root system, and that mixed in with wheat, pulling the darnel plants out by the root would have damaged or killed many of the wheat plants whose roots had become entwined with the darnel roots. The reason that we highly suspect that darnel is the weed in question here is the fact that ancient unscrupulous farmers would go out in the dead of night and sow darnel in the fields of their business rivals. So common was this practice that Rome actually had a law against the illicit sowing of darnel. So it's highly likely that this is the practice to which Jesus was referring. In our story, the slaves who discover the unexpected addition to their crop ask their master if he's sure that the seed that he planted was good and not tainted. I would imagine that the slaves may have been concerned that they might be blamed for the unwanted darnel that had been planted in the field. But when the slaves asked their master if they should pull out the weeds, their master, aware of the potential damage to the wheat should they do that, advised them to allow the darnel to continue to grow alongside the wheat so that none of the wheat plants would be harmed. When Jesus and the disciples left the crowds behind and returned to the house in which they were staying, the disciples asked Jesus to explain the parable. Jesus provided a very straightforward explanation, just saying that the field is the word, the sower is Jesus, The good seed are the people of the kingdom, the weeds are the people of the evil one, and the enemy, well, that's Satan. And here is where today's reading starts to get interesting. Because for hundreds of years, there have been Jewish parables with which Jesus' listeners would have been quite familiar. And in these Jewish parables, God is almost always represented by the landowner. In this parable, the enemy is almost always Satan himself. The wheat traditionally represents Israel, while the weeds represent the Gentiles. And so, viewing this parable through this lens, Jesus appears to be telling a story about the redemption of Israel and the judgment of the Gentiles. But that isn't what Jesus said. Rather than the wheat being Israel and the weeds being the Gentiles, and this is important, Jesus declares the wheat to be the people of the kingdom and the weeds to be the people of the evil one. And in saying this, Jesus is declaring that the good portion of this mixed crop, the wheat, representing the people of the kingdom, is those who are hearing and living his word. And the good portion of this mixed crop is not accepted to be Israel as traditionally thought, but is instead understood to be those from the ends of the earth who have heard and received the gospel message. And some of these people are going to be Gentiles. And the bad portion of the mixed crop, the weeds representing the people of the evil one, are not being considered to be the Gentiles, but rather are those who have heard the word and have rejected it. And some of these people are going to be Israelites. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law and the Jewish people who have failed to recognize, or more accurately, flat out rejected Jesus, are the people of the evil one. And it is they who are the invasive plants in this narrative. Now, as I said earlier, the first century listeners to this parable would have been wondering if this landowner was nuts, allowing the darnel to continue to grow alongside the wheat. Having the darnel mixed with the wheat will ruin the crop, and the easiest, best time to remove the darnel would be immediately after it sprouted leaves. And so removing the darnel at that time would have been the best bet to protect his crop. But removing the darnel also would have damaged a significant portion of the good crop. Now, if this farmer is making a value judgment about the pros and cons of removing the darnel, then removing it would absolutely be the best bet, and removing it at the earliest possible time would minimize the damage done to the rest of his crops. This is why farmers used to do this, because it would cause his rival a loss of crops and a loss of income, as many good plants would be destroyed in the process of removing the darnel. But this parable is not a real farmer with a real problem. This parable is something that Jesus has thrown alongside. If you'll recall, last week we defined parable as meaning something that is thrown alongside. So this is something that was thrown alongside to allow us to make comparisons that lead us to a truth. And what Jesus is really telling us here is that God, in his great love and patience, is going to allow the people of the evil one to continue to live among the people of the kingdom in order to ensure that every single one of his beloved children has every available opportunity to turn to him and to live. Does this mingling of the children of the evil one and the children of the kingdom have the potential to create real-world problems for people, especially for the children of the kingdom? Absolutely, and it often does. And when this happens, there can be no question that these real-world problems can seem to be deeply unfair. And to those who have not yet received the word, these real-world problems could appear to be a sign to them that God doesn't care or that he doesn't exist at all. But when we stop to think about this, we come to the very difficult conclusion that those who are calling this unfair are thinking only about themselves. They are not thinking about those who are desperately in need of hearing the word. And as hard as it may be to accept this, Christians are called to think about others before they think about themselves. The question that the Christian needs to be asking themselves in these circumstances is, am I willing to be inconvenienced, to be disadvantaged, or even to be hurt in order that another person may have the time that they need to become a child of the kingdom? Is temporary suffering a reasonable price to pay for the saving of the eternal soul of another human being? It's a tough question, isn't it? And it is the exact question that Jesus had to answer for himself in the Garden of Gethsemane. The exact question that caused Jesus to sweat great drops of blood. It is a very, very, very difficult question indeed. But the believer always needs to remember that God's highest priority is reconciliation. And the believer also needs to remember that if God instantly judged sin, there would be nobody left, because we're all sinners saved only by the grace, love, and patience of God. It's just that we happen to be saved a little earlier than some others. And so Jesus asks his children to persevere, to hang in there, and to continue to love others, and to continue to share the gospel. Because as the old saying goes, the people of the evil one are not the enemy, they are victims of the enemy. And God is seeking to reconcile as many of those people of the evil one to himself as he possibly can. And God is calling on us to be the ones who bring to them the words of salvation, the words of life. What is it that Jesus said? Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Chelsea Harmon says the reality of how farming works, both then and now, is a cue for us to pay attention to the surprise in this parable. The surprise that the farmer doesn't remove the threat to the wheat until the harvest challenges us to trust the farmer who is seemingly going about his trade in the wrong way. This parable isn't a lesson on how we approach evil in the world. It's about being able to comprehend the bigger picture of the reality that the kingdom is already here, but evil is still present and will be present until the final judgment. The key for the believer is to trust. Do we trust that God knows what he is doing? Do we? Do we trust that God has a plan? And do we trust that God will not only make all things right, but that God is going to make all things awesome beyond our capacity to understand? I can't say this loudly enough. God will reward the faithful. We must have trust that, as Paul wrote to the church in Corinth, no eye has seen, no ear has heard, and no mind has conceived the things that God has prepared for those who love him. And as for those who choose not to love him, well, all of that darnel is going to be gathered, bundled, and thrown into the fire. That blazing furnace, it's not a joke. However it is that we choose to understand that blazing furnace, and this really is just another instance of the finite trying to understand the infinite, whether we accept the existence of eternal flames, or whether we accept this as allegorical, or whether we accept this as something that is just totally beyond our comprehension, the one thing of which we are absolutely certain is the fact that there is going to come a time when the people of the evil one will be eternally separated from God, separated from God's love, separated from God's care, separated from God's righteousness. And if that isn't hell, then I don't know what is. The truth is, when I stop to think about this, separation from God isn't something that I would wish on my worst enemy. And so, in spite of the potential for difficulties, the call to us is to trust God, to believe that He knows what He is doing, and most important, to believe that His plan is good, even when we can't see that ourselves. His call to us is to, as we are going, bring the gospel to the ends of the earth. We must carry the good news even to the people of the evil one. We must love others, even those who are difficult to love, even those who reject our love, because this is exactly what Jesus did. And so we emulate Jesus in a way that through our love, and even through our love for the people of the evil one, those to whom we witness may discover for themselves this incredible love that God has for them. Judgment is a hard thing to talk about. It's even a hard thing to think about. The fact that there are those who will suffer an eternity separated from God is too horrible a thought to even consider. And this is why we make the hard choice to love the unlovable. For those of us who are repulsed at the very idea of final judgment, I would like to close with something that I have said many times in my lifetime to many different people who have asked me questions about the judgment. And that is that when the day comes that God reconciles the world to Himself, we will all stand in open-mouthed astonishment at the depth of God's mercy and at the rightness of His judgments. And until that day comes, my friend, we are going to have to put our faith in Him and trust Him. Amen.